Nansen was a little bit disappointed when he discovered the depth of the Arctic Ocean. As he stated, the Arctic was assumed to have a number of small islands, and it was from these that the animal and plant forms originated. These men are hundreds of miles in from the Arctic Circle, and the plethora of animal and plant life reported is just incredible. These animals are not going to travel hundreds of miles from solid ground and a source of food, unless there's something there that can sustain them. One such animal seen up here in large numbers is the musk ox. Observed around the islands of the Svalbard archipelago, it has also been observed heading north. But I'll just read some of the descriptions of the animals and plants these men came across. Hayes writes in his diary when he was at latitude 78 degrees 17 minutes, early in July, "Today I secured a yellow-winged butterfly, and, who would believe it, a mosquito. Also 10 moths, 3 spiders, 2 bees and 2 flies." Greeley reports birds of an unknown species, butterflies, flies, and temperatures of 47 to 50 degrees, also plenty of willow to make fires, and much fresh driftwood. He found 2 flowers different from any that he had ever seen before. Sverdrup found so many hares around 81 degrees north latitude, that one inlet was called Hare Fjord. There was also enough other game to keep the whole exploring party well fed with meat. Captain Beechey saw so many birds on the west coast of Spitsbergen, that the place reverberated with their cries from dawn till dark. The little auk were so numerous, and so close together, that sometimes a single shot killed 30 of them. With 16 birds to a yard 3, there were about 4 million of them. Rotgers were so numerous as to darken the sky, and their chorus could be heard for 4 miles. There were also reindeer and ducks. There were 4 varieties of seagulls over the surrounding ocean, plus fish and amphibious animals, from the huge whale to the minute Clio on which it feeds, swallowing perhaps 1 million with each mouthful. Franklin saw large numbers of geese migrating to the unknown north, at a high latitude, indicating land there. He notes that no matter how far north the explorer goes, he always finds the polar bear ahead of him. No matter how far north these bears are met, they are always on their way north. At latitude 82 degrees, Kane found butterflies, bees and flies, as well as wolves, foxes, bears, geese, ducks, waterfowls and partridges. A strange fact all explorers observe is that animals do not migrate south to escape the cold Arctic winter, but instead go north. Kane states on page 180. The Brent goose had not been seen before since entering Smith Straits. It is well known to the polar traveler as a migratory bird of the American continent. Like the others of the same family, it feeds upon vegetable matter, generally on marine plants with their adherent molluscous life. It is rarely or never seen in the interior, and from its habits may be regarded as singularly indicative of open water. The flocks of this bird, easily distinguished by their wedge-shaped line of flight, now cross the water obliquely, and disappeared over the land to the north and east. I had shot these birds on the coast of Wellington Channel in latitude 74 degrees 50 minutes, nearly 6 degrees to the south. They were then flying in the same direction. So here he is, 350 miles further north, and he's still observing these birds heading north. As he states, they need open water and sea plants to survive, so where are they to find that beyond 80 degrees 50 minutes north latitude, if the pole is indeed a solid sheet of ice from 80.5 degrees to the geographical pole at 90 degrees? These birds can only be flying to the open water that I previously mentioned. In Volume 1, page 471 of Nansen's Farthest North. 1894, August 3. Today my longing has at last been satisfied. I have shot Ross's gull, 3 specimens in one day. This rare mysterious inhabitant of the unknown north, which is only occasionally seen, and of which no one knows where it came from, or where it goes, which belongs exclusively to the world to which the imagination aspires. In Volume 2 page 313. Monday, July 15. As we were working on the kayaks yesterday, a Ross's gull came flying by. It was a full-grown bird, and made a turn when just over us, showing its pretty rose-color breast, and then disappeared again in the mist southward. On Thursday I saw another adult Ross's gull, with a black ring around its neck. It came from the northeast, and flew in a southwesterly direction. On page 315. Friday, July 19. Two full-grown Ross's gulls flew over here from the northeast and went west this morning. When far off they uttered cries which reminded me of that of the wryneck, and which I at first thought came from a little auk. They flew quite low, just over my head, and the rose color of their under parts could be seen plainly. Another Ross's gull flew by her yesterday. It is strange that there should be so many of them. Where are we? So Ross's gull is indeed a bit of a mystery. It arrives for the Arctic summer scene from the northeast as we've seen here from Nansen. It then spends the summer months around the Svalbard archipelago, and has been seen as far south as Ireland and California in the United States. It's then seen heading north with the onset of the Arctic winter, where it's claimed that these birds winter at the edge of the ice pack. But this bird wasn't observed in the Arctic region during the winter period. Nansen was quite surprised to see so many of them, but they were only observed during the summer months. Hence, no one knows where they came from as they're coming from the northeast, or where they go, as they head north for the Arctic winter. On page 186, of volume 2 of Nansen's Farthest North. I was not a little surprised yesterday morning when I suddenly saw the track of an animal in the snow. It was that of a fox, came about west-southwest true, and went in an easterly direction. The trail was quite fresh. What in the world was the fox doing up here? There were also unequivocal signs that it had not been without food. Were we in the vicinity of land? I looked around for it, but the weather was thick all day yesterday, and we might have been near it without seeing it. In any case, a warm-blooded mammal in the 85th parallel. We had not gone far before we came across another fox track. It went in about the same direction as the other, and followed the trend of the lane which had stopped us and by which we had been obliged to camp. It is incomprehensible what these animals live on up here, but presumably they are able to snap up some crustaceans in the open waterways. But why do they leave the coasts? That is what puzzles me most. Can they have gone astray? There seems to be little probability of that. Now this is an absolutely incredible observation from Nansen, and you seriously have to ask yourself, what the bloody hell is the fox doing at 85 degrees north latitude? He has ventured hundreds of miles from the safety of solid ground, onto an ever-changing sheet of ice that opens up, forcing the fox to walk around it, resulting in his journey being even longer. So this animal and the others like him, are putting a lot of effort into getting up to these high northern latitudes, and as Nansen stated, there were clear signs that they are indeed being fed. These animals are simply not going to travel these great distances for absolutely nothing. They are traveling north because the temperate climate associated with the land beyond the pole, affects Earth's terrestrial plane at this region all year round. Giannini stated that it was possible for a human being to walk off this Earth when the conditions are just right at the poles, and that's what the fox, the polar bear, and the muskox can do. They can walk to these islands when not obstructed by open water at the geographical pole. In Mercator's document, it stated that the islands are surrounded by ice from October to March. All but one of the river mouths freezes because of the rushing water. So at some point, the ice reaches these islands. But the animal life I've read out doesn't even scratch the surface of the documented wildlife observed up there. The small portion I went through was observed from 78 degrees north latitude up to here at 85 degrees, which one wouldn't expect to find in one of the coldest regions of the Earth and being hundreds of miles in from the Arctic Circle. But to me, the warm wind that originates from the fixed principle at the pole, contributes immensely to the favorable conditions reported up here that support such an abundance of wildlife. The effects of which can be felt hundreds of miles from the pole. Another strange phenomenon reported up here is the driftwood, which many of them have come across. Again, we are hundreds of miles in from the tree line here, so you wouldn't expect to be coming across it in this region. The ice drifts south as it moves away from the pole, so it would be extremely difficult for it to get from beyond the coastline of the mainland continents to where it was found. In H.D. Barrington's book it's mentioned a couple of times that the driftwood could not come to the northward of Spitsbergen, in case the seas between the north of Asia and that island were frozen, whereas a great quantity of that wood is driven on the north coast of Iceland, which is a demonstration that the currents come from the northeast. That in some of the trees the marks of the axe were very plain, and the color of the wood so fresh, that they certainly hadn't been 6 months in the sea. That some whole trees appeared with buds thereon, which they think could not have remained so fresh, if the trees had been a year in the salt water. On page 67 of the Smoky God. On the third day we came to an island. Its shores were washed by an open sea. My father determined to land and explore for a day. This new land was destitute of timber, but we found a large accumulation of driftwood on the northern shore. Some of the trunks of the trees were 40 feet long and 2 feet in diameter. So an island in the high Arctic which is destitute of its own timber, has a northern-facing shore covered with tree trunks. The nearest trees are located hundreds of miles to the south. How did they get to this side of the island? In Adolphus Greely's 3 Years of Active Service, Volume 1 page 100. In the search, however, Private Connell and Frederick found a large coniferous tree on the beach just above extreme high water mark. It was about 30 inches in circumference, some 30 feet long, and had apparently been carried to that point by a current within a couple of years. In Nansen's Farthest North Volume 2 page 185. As we were hastening along, we suddenly came across an immense piece of timber sticking up obliquely from the surface of the ice. It was Siberian larch, as far as I could make out, and probably raised in this manner through pressure long ago. Many a good meal could we have cooked with it had we been able to drag it with us, but it was too heavy. We marked it, FN, HJ, 85 degrees 30 minutes north, and went on our way. Nansen's Farthest North Volume 1 page 303. It seemed as though the longer I defended my theory, the nearer I came to doubting it. But no, there is no getting over the evidence of that Siberian driftwood. So Nansen was convinced that the animal and plant forms that he observed were coming from the islands that he believed was in front of him beyond 85 degrees north latitude. Would a tree trunk from the mainland coast be able to reach 85 degrees through hundreds of miles of pack ice? It's the same with the other phenomena reported up here, such as the pollen and volcanic dust, which is found in thick layers all over the ice. In Kane's Arctic Explorations page 28. We passed the crimson cliffs of Sir John Ross in the forenoon of August 5. The patches of red snow, from which they derived their name, could be seen clearly at the distance of 10 miles from the coast. It had a fine deep rose hue, not at all like the brown stain which I noticed when I was here before. All the gorges and ravines in which the snows had lodged were deeply tinted with it. I had no difficulty now in justifying the somewhat poetical nomenclature which Sir John Franklin applied to this locality, for if the snowy surface were more diffused, as it is no doubt earlier in the season, crimson would be the prevailing color. Nansen's Farthest North Volume 1 page 503. I imagine this brown color must be due to the organisms I found in the newly frozen brownish red ice last autumn, but the specimens I took today consist, for the most part, of mineral dust mingled with diatoms and other ingredients of organic origin. Blessing collected several specimens on the upper surface of the ice earlier in the summer, and came to the same conclusions. I must look further into this, in order to see whether all this brown dust is of a mineral nature, and consequently originates from the land. On page 209 of Phantom of the Poles, by William Reed. Why is the snow colored in the Arctic regions? What causes it to be colored? The snow has been analyzed, and the red, green and yellow have been found to contain vegetable matter, presumably a flower, or the pollen of a plant. The black snow has also been analyzed, and found to contain carbon and iron, supposed to have come from a volcanic eruption. But whence did it come? A flower that produces pollen sufficient to permeate the air, with such density that it colored the snow, would require a vast territory, millions of acres to grow it. Where is that to be found? If on Earth, it must be near the North Pole, for, if it grew elsewhere, colored snow would be found at other locations, and not be confined to the Arctic regions. To the authors William Reed and Marshall B. Gardner, this pollen and volcanic dust originated from inside the globe, and was carried to the Arctic region where it is deposited on the ice by the warm wind from the north. The very same thing is taking place from Giannini's perspective. Also found on the ice by many of these Arctic explorers are large rocks, mud and gravel. Charles Francis Hall states on page 392. On the 20th, the ice pressed very heavily against the Polaris, especially on her starboard quarter. At 1 p.m., an old floe, more than 20 feet thick, came floating slowly toward her. Much doubt was felt as to her safety. Fortunately, however, when within a short distance it grounded. On striking, it broke into many pieces, which, turning over, exposed massive rocks embedded in the ice. So again, Nansen's soundings proved that there was no land in the Arctic Ocean. At a depth of 13,000 feet, there has been no land in any recent geological period. So where did these rocks originate from that they are embedded within the ice? In Nansen's Farthest North Volume 2 page 190. Friday, April 26. At the end of our day, yesterday, we went across many lanes and piled up ridges. In one of the latter, which appeared to be quite new, immense pieces of freshwater ice had been pressed up. They were closely intermixed with clay and gravel, the result of infiltration, so that at a distance the blocks looked dark brown, and might easily be taken for stone. In fact, I really thought they were stone. I can only imagine that this ice is river ice, probably from Siberia. I often saw huge pieces of freshwater ice of this kind farther north, and even in latitude 86 degrees, there was clay on the ice. So how on earth can clay and gravel be sitting on the top of the ice at 86 degrees? That's simply impossible. Again, there's no land in the Arctic Ocean, so this infiltration didn't take place on the Earth. He also mentions this river ice and can clearly distinguish the difference between them, but he attributes it to originate from Siberia. If we remember back to Olaf's father when they discovered the freshwater, he stated he was mad because there was no land in sight. Is he thinking a river was affecting the salt content of the water around them? But sticking with Giannini's concept, it all originates from that fixed principle at the pole. The tree trunks, the huge rocks, gravel and clay all fall onto the ice during the winter months. The fresh water is issued from these rivers when they are flowing in a southerly direction. Which is exactly what happens to the mammoth, which have been found in northern glacial deposits for hundreds of years now. Olaf Jansen described a mammoth which was 85 feet tall. Admiral Byrd also observed an animal resembling the mammoth as he was flying over the pole. So in Paradise Found page 297 it states, "The Arctic rocks tell of a more wonderful lost Atlantis than Plato's. The fossil ivory beds of Siberia excel everything of the kind in the world. From the days of Pliny, at least, they have constantly been undergoing exploitation, and still they are the chief headquarters of supply. The remains of the mammoth are so abundant that, as Gratacap says, the northern islands of Siberia seem built up of its crowded bones." Another scientific writer, speaking of the islands of New Siberia, northward of the mouth of the river Lena, uses this language: large quantities of ivory are dug out of the ground every year. Indeed, some of the islands are believed to be nothing but an accumulation of drift timber, and the bodies of mammoths and other antediluvian animals frozen together. From this we may infer that during the years that have elapsed since the Russian conquest of Siberia, useful tusks from more than 20,000 mammoths have been collected. These islands are believed by the locals to be comprised of driftwood and the bones of mammoths. And that simply boils down to the large numbers of these that have been found here. To them it's an accumulation that would be centuries in the making, because they would be continually building up over time as they would be drifting to these islands from the same place. A Journey to the Earth's Interior, by Marshall B. Gardner. In here he mentions the first recorded find of a fresh mammoth as being in 1806. This find was made by a Mr. Adams in the employ of the St. Petersburg Museum. The carcass was no sooner exposed than bears took the first opportunity to devour what they could reach. Another remarkable case, by Professor Hens of the St. Petersburg Zoological Museum in 1901, was so perfectly preserved that its flesh was not only in perfect condition, but its stomach was full of undigested food and it even had traces of its last meal between its teeth. So this professor held a lavish banquet where everything on the menu was supposedly thousands of years old. They had wheat from Egyptian tombs and other preserved products from the ruins of Pompeii and Herculaneum. But the main course was a fresh steak from this newly discovered mammoth. Now also found in northern glacial deposits are hairy rhinoceros, reindeer, hippopotamus, lions and hyenas. Since these are present-day forms of life and are found alongside those of the mammoth, Gardner concludes that it is quite possible that they sometimes wander too far from their habitats, become stranded on detached ice floes, or fall into crevasses in glaciers, and are then carried to the positions in which they have been found by modern explorers on the Earth. So once again, the same thing is taking place from Giannini's perspective. This is how the infiltration of the ice takes place. The mouths of the rivers freeze over, which results in these animals, trees, huge rocks, gravel and clay falling or being knocked on top of the ice, which then carries it to the Earth. Mercator's map depicts two magnetic mountains, one at the geographical pole and also a smaller one around 73 degrees north latitude. As we've seen, they do not represent a physical object that can be observed but instead represent a magnetic effect within the Arctic region. Now, between these two locations on the Earth, there's a phenomenon known up in the Arctic region which is referred to as the dipping of the needle. While on the lower latitudes of the Earth, the compass needle works by remaining horizontal or level, and some would assume that it would be attracted to the geographical pole, that being the magnetic pole. But that's not the case, not at first anyway, I don't think. Up here it operates a bit odd, which, like everything else associated with this region of the Earth, baffles those fortunate enough to witness it. Rear Admiral Robert Edwin Peary was an American explorer and United States Navy officer, who made several expeditions to the Arctic in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In Peary's first voyage, page 67. It had been observed that from the moment they had entered Lancaster Sound, the motion of the compass needle was very sluggish, and both this and its deviation increased as they progressed to the westward, and continued to do so in descending this inlet. Having reached latitude 73 degrees, they witnessed for the first time the curious phenomenon of the directive power of the needle becoming so weak as to be completely overcome by the attraction of the ship, so that the needle might now be said to point to the North Pole of the ship. The March 1962 issue of Flying Saucers magazine, which was written by the editor Ray Palmer, this edition was entitled The North Pole Russian Style, and contained the following subtitle: More Evidence of Mystery Lands at the Poles. 200 years of exploration have given the Russians a new concept of the pole, and render all previous geographies obsolete. So, with Ray Palmer being a hollow earth advocate, he's applying this information from the Russians to that theory. But like everything else we've gone over, it can work from Giannini's perspective too. Either way, it gives as good a reason as any as to what that rock represents on Mercator's map. We have available, in the form of records of several hundred years, in Russian archives, a history of Arctic exploration which proves our most important point beyond further question, that the North Magnetic Pole is not a point, but, deduce the Russians, a line, approximately 1,000 miles long. Ray Palmer interjects, we might suggest that we think they are wrong in this deduction, and that instead of being a line, it is actually a circle. Because of lack of space to place it on the globe, the Russians have been forced to compress their observations into a two-dimensional area. They had to squeeze the circle from two sides and make a line out of it. We'd like to give you now a resume of that single point of Russian exploration, which actually covers much more than just geomagnetism. Navigators in the high latitudes have always been troubled by the odd behavior of their magnetic compasses, caused by apparent irregularities and asymmetries in the magnetic field of the Earth. Early magnetic maps have been drawn on this assumption, based on hopeful guesses, that the North Magnetic Pole is virtually a point. Accordingly, it was expected that the compass needle, which dips more steeply as it approaches the magnetic pole, would point straight down, or very nearly so, at the magnetic pole itself. But data from many Russian and other expeditions showed that the compass needle points straight down for a very long distance across the Arctic Ocean, from a point northwest of the Timor Peninsula, to another point in the Arctic archipelago. As stated by the Russians there, this magnetic ring extends across the Arctic Ocean for hundreds of miles. So when Robert Peary sailed onto the 73rd degree of north latitude, his compass was drawn down because his ship was now over this magnetic ring which circles the pole, and it is this magnetic ring that the compass is initially attracted to when on the lower latitudes of the Earth. Ray Palmer then states, between each magnetic pole around the Earth pass magnetic meridians. In contrast with geographical meridians, which measure longitude, the magnetic meridians move from east to west and back again. The difference between the geographical meridians, or true north and south, and the direction in which a magnetic compass points, or the magnetic meridian of the place, is called the declination. The first observation made was in London in 1580, and showed an easterly declination of 11 degrees. In 1815, the declination reached 24.3 degrees westerly maximum. This makes a difference of 35.3 degrees change in 235 years, which is equal to 2,118 miles. Now if we make a circle around the pole, with a radius of 1,059 miles, so that it is 2,118 miles in diameter. This would represent the rim of the polar opening along which, in this case, the North Magnetic Pole traveled from one point to its diametrically opposite point on the circle, 2,118 miles away, in 235 years. The focal point, or the actual pinpoint, of the magnetic pole exists on only one portion of the circumference of that circle at a time, and moves progressively around the circle in a definite orbit that takes some 235 years. This would make the magnetic pole travel approximately 18 miles per year. So a circle with a diameter of 2,118 miles would place it around where it's depicted on Mercator's map. But Palmer describes how the magnetic pole travels around this circle over a 235-year cycle. So once again I'm just going to speculate that this is a major contributing factor as to how this ice opens up. Wherever the magnetic pole is located on this circle each year, that is where the ice will open up, allowing access to the open sea behind it. We've seen from H.D. Barrington and others that you can be restricted by the ice year after year, and then one year you'll have a clear run and be able to get much further north. So the magnetic effect of this ring, coupled with the warm wind blowing above the ice and the fresh and warm water below it, all contribute to how the ice is governed up in this region. Now, as the compass is drawn down for a long distance across the Arctic Ocean due to this magnetic ring, when you have sailed beyond it, the compass then begins to do the complete opposite. Adolphus Greely was given command of the ship Proteus in 1881 and reached 83 degrees 24 minutes north, 40 degrees 46 minutes west. In his book 3 Years of Arctic Service, he states the following in the preface. Fearing exaggeration, I have occasionally modified statements and opinions entered in my original journal, believing it better to underrate than enlarge the wonders of the Arctic regions, which have been too often questioned. So this fella couldn't divulge his true observations and experiences because he was afraid of what others might say. Which demonstrates the stranglehold the scientific community can have on people. He didn't want the disciples of his day accusing him of exaggeration or even hallucination because of the plethora of strange phenomena he witnessed. But even though he holds back, what he does tell us is still incredible. He states on page 127 in relation to the magnetic compass. For the uninitiated it should be said, that the object of these readings was to note the declination of the magnetic needle. In the greater part of the world, the compass does not point to the geographical pole, as the saying, true as the needle to the pole, is only an inaccurate simile. The magnetic declination of any place is the difference between the geographical pole and the quarter to which the needle actually points, and is measured in degrees to east or west. For instance, where the needle points to the true west, the declination is said to be 90 degrees west, and when pointing to the southwest, to be 135 degrees west. At Fort Conger, in 1882, the magnetic needle pointed between the west and southwest, the declination being 100 degrees 13 minutes west. In the magnetometer a small magnet, freely suspended by a single fiber of untwisted silk, swings readily in any horizontal direction. This magnet at Conger was never quiet, not even on what are technically known as calm days, but swung to and fro in a restless, uneasy way, which at various times impressed me with an uncanny feeling quite foreign to my nature. As it swung to right and left, its movements were clearly outlined on a fixed, illumined, glass scale, which served as a background, and the extreme oscillations, seen through a small telescope by the observer, were recorded. In the other end of the building was placed, on a stable pier, a dip circle, from which the inclination or dip of the magnetic needle was hourly determined. A magnetic needle, nicely and delicately balanced, in the middle latitudes assumes a nearly level position. At Conger, however, the needle, adjusted so that it can move freely on a vertical plane, shows a strong tendency to assume an upright position. At a dip of 90 degrees the needle would be erect, while at Conger, the inclination was about 85 degrees. Now, that is remarkable, and you can see why it gave him an uncanny feeling, which as he says was quite foreign to his nature. Of course it was, where else on the earth does the compass point up at such a steep angle? Nansen also describes the same phenomenon. In Volume 2 page 19 he states, "One day, it was November 24th, he came in to supper a little after 6 o'clock quite alarmed and said, there has just been a singular inclination of the needle to 24 degrees, and, remarkably enough, its northern extremity pointed to the east. I cannot remember ever having heard of such an inclination." He also had several others of about 15 degrees. And then we have the Olaf Jensen account, and he's much closer to the pole. We had scarcely appeased our hunger, when a breeze began filling the idle sails, and, glancing at the compass, we found the northern point pressing hard against the glass. In response to my surprise, my father said, "I have heard of this before, it is what they call the dipping of the needle." We loosened the compass and turned it at right angles with the surface of the sea before its point would free itself from the glass and point according to unmolested attraction. It shifted uneasily, and seemed as unsteady as a drunken man, but finally pointed a course. So from a hollow Earth perspective, the compass anomalies start when one ventures onto this section of the Earth. As Ray Palmer stated, the magnetic ring leads to the polar opening. After sailing beyond that magnetic ring, at some point, the crust of the Earth as well as the ocean, must dip as it approaches a more convex section of the Earth. So the strange compass behavior has been attributed to the traversing of this section of the hollow Earth. In the case of Olaf Jensen, once on the other side of the pole, or inside the globe, he makes reference to the compass a couple of times, and his surprise that it remained pointing north the entire 2.5 years they were there. And that's after traveling thousands of miles, even exiting via the South Pole. So if it's this section from a hollow Earth perspective that is the cause of the magnetic anomalies, it will be this section of the fixed principle from Giannini's. So Mount Sumeru would be a magnetic toroidal field. The magnetic ring runs through the very rock of the Arctic seabed, which in turn merges with what is essentially more land, that magnetically links the two planes comprising the shell of a concave structure, creating a pathway-type structure between them. The magnetic ring would also be responsible for producing the aurora borealis. In the book The Smoky God, Olaf describes his experience of observing the fake or hoax sun while at the furthest parts of the north. On page 109. One day about this time, my father startled me by calling my attention to a novel sight far in front of us, almost at the horizon. "It is a mock sun," exclaimed my father. "I have read of them, it is called a reflection or mirage. It will soon pass away." But this dull red, false sun, as we supposed it to be, did not pass away for several hours, and while we were unconscious of its emitting any rays of light, still there was no time thereafter when we could not sweep the horizon in front and locate the illumination of the so-called false sun, during a period of at least 12 hours out of every 24. Clouds and mists would at times almost, but never entirely, hide its location. Gradually it seemed to climb higher in the horizon of the uncertain purple sky as we advanced. It could hardly be said to resemble the sun, except in its circular shape, and when not obscured by clouds or the ocean mists, it had a hazy red, bronzed appearance, which would change to a white like a luminous cloud, as if reflecting some greater light beyond. We finally agreed in our discussion of this smoky furnace-colored sun, that, whatever the cause of the phenomenon, it was not a reflection of our sun, but a planet of some sort, a reality. From a hollow Earth perspective, Olaf perceives this phenomena as a separate body, as another luminary. He can see it rise in front of him as he proceeds northward. Observing this luminous spectacle for 12 hours out of 24. To him it's a physical object, one he's now starting to observe as he ventures over the highest convex point and into the globe. A few days later, after traveling a great distance beyond the known boundaries of the Earth, he describes this luminary again. On page 115. In the meantime we had lost sight of the sun's rays, but we found a radiance within emanating from the dull red sun which had already attracted our attention, now giving out a white light seemingly from a cloud bank far away in front of us. It dispensed a greater light, I should say, than 2 full moons on the clearest night. In 12 hours this cloud of whiteness would pass out of sight as if eclipsed, and the 12 hours following corresponded with our night. And then we have this description on page 115. The great luminous cloud or ball of dull red fire, fiery red in the mornings and evenings, and during the day giving off a beautiful white light, the smoky god, is seemingly suspended in the center of the great vacuum within the Earth, and held to its place by the immutable law of gravitation, or a repellent atmospheric force, as the case may be. I refer to the known power that draws or repels with equal force in all directions. The base of this electrical cloud or central luminary, the seat of the gods, is dark and non-transparent, save for innumerable small openings, seemingly in the bottom of the great support or altar of the deity, upon which the smoky god rests, and, the lights shining through these many openings twinkle at night in all their splendor, and seem to be stars, as natural as the stars we saw shining when in our home at Stockholm, excepting that they appear larger. The smoky god, therefore, with each daily revolution of the earth, appears to come up in the east and go down in the west, the same as does our sun on the external surface. So from Giannini's perspective, I think the first observation of the fake sun could be considered a reflection. As stated in a previous quote, Sumeru is heard to be in the center of the earth, but is not seen there. So as the sun was behind him, this luminous phenomena was rising as he progressed northward. As Mount Sumeru cannot be seen, could he be observing the sun reflecting off the water which is off in the distance? Anyway, as we get different descriptions of this luminary, from locations that are great distances apart, applied to Giannini's concept, he would be observing the same sun as there's only one in this universal structure. But due to the locations, each so-called world is a different distance from the sun, each with a different atmospheric density and underlying oxygen content, each resonating at its own frequency. So the sun is being observed from different angles and through different atmospheric conditions, all from different locations separated by thousands of miles or even tens of thousands of miles. This results in the observer seeing the same sun but with different fluctuations in colors and shadings along the electromagnetic spectrum. So the account of Olaf Jensen, told in the book The Smoky God, is an incredibly detailed account of a human being, in fact, a 19-year-old boy and his Norwegian father, who sailed beyond the North Pole in the year 1829. Unfortunately, it had a tragic and sad ending some 2.5 years after first setting out, resulting in the death of his father upon reaching Antarctica via the North Pole, and him being confined to a mental asylum, upon the disclosure as to how he became stranded on a floating iceberg alone in Antarctica. We've heard his descriptions of getting through the ice and into the open sea. I'll now go through the relevant material to describe what this land beyond the North Pole is supposedly like. Along the banks, great forests miles in extent could be seen stretching away on the shoreline. The trees were of enormous size. We landed after anchoring near a sandy beach, and waded ashore, and were rewarded by finding a quantity of nuts that were very palatable and satisfying to hunger, and a welcome change from the monotony of our stock of provisions. The bank of the river, covered with mammoth trees, rose up several hundred feet in beautiful fashion. We seemed to be on the edge of some primeval forest that doubtless stretched far inland. Vegetation grew in lavish exuberance, and fruit of all kinds possessed the most delicate flavor. Clusters of grapes 4 and 5 feet in length, each grape as large as an orange, and apples larger than a man's head, typified the wonderful growth of all things on the inside of the earth. The great redwood trees of California would be considered mere underbrush, compared with the giant forest trees extending for miles and miles in all directions. In many directions along the foothills of the mountains, vast herds of cattle were seen during the last day of our travel on the river. In our travels we came to a forest of gigantic trees, near the city of Delphi. Had the Bible said there were trees towering over 300 feet in height, and more than 30 feet in diameter, growing in the Garden of Eden, the Ingersolls, the Tom Paines and Voltaires, would doubtless have pronounced the statement a myth. Yet this is the description of California Sequoia gigantea, but these California giants pale into insignificance when compared with the forest Goliaths found in the within continent. Where abound mighty trees from 800 to 1,000 feet in height, and from 100 to 120 feet in diameter, countless in numbers and forming forests extending hundreds of miles back from the sea. The city of Eden is located in what seems to be a beautiful valley, yet, in fact, it is on the loftiest mountain plateau of the inner continent, several thousand feet higher than any portion of the surrounding country. It is the most beautiful place I have ever beheld in all my travels. In this elevated garden all manner of fruits, vines, shrubs, trees, and flowers grow in riotous profusion. In this garden 4 rivers have their source in a mighty artesian fountain. They divide and flow in 4 directions. This place is called by the inhabitants the navel of the earth, or the beginning, the cradle of the human race. The names of the rivers are the Euphrates, the Pison, the Gihon, and the Hiddekel. In the book The Travels of Sir John Mandeville page 200. Of paradise I cannot speak properly, For I was not there. It is far beyond. And that forthinketh me. And also I was not worthy. But as I have heard say of wise men beyond, I shall tell you with good will. Terrestrial paradise, as wise men say, is the highest place of earth, that is in all the world. And it is so high that it almost touches the circle of the moon, as the moon makes her turn. For she is so high that the flood of Noah might not come to her, that would have covered all the earth of the world all about and above and beneath, except paradise. And this paradise is enclosed all about with a wall, and men do not know where it is, for the walls be covered all over with moss, as it seems. And it seems that the wall is not a stone of nature, and of none other thing that the wall is. And that wall stretches from the south to the north, and it has not but one entry that is closed with fire, burning, so that no man that is mortal dare not enter. And in the most high place of paradise, even in the middle place, is a well that casts out the 4 floods that run by divers lands. Of which, the first is called Pisan, or Ganges, that is all one, and it runs throughout India or Emlock, in which river be many precious stones, and much of lignum aloes and much gravel of gold. And that other river is called Nilus or Gisan, that goes by Ethiopia and after by Egypt. And that other is called Tigris, that runs by Assyria and by Armenia the Great. And that other is called Euphrates, that runs also by Media and Armenia and by Persia. And men there beyond say, that all the sweet waters of the world, above and beneath, take their beginning of the well of paradise, and out of that well all waters come and go. And on page 201. And ye shall understand that no man that is mortal may not approach to that paradise. For by land no man may go, for wild beasts that are in the deserts, and for the high mountains and great huge rocks that no man may pass by, for the dark places that are there, and that many. And by the rivers may no man go. For the water runs so rudely and so sharply, because that it comes down so outrageously from the high places above, that it runs in so great waves, that no ship may row or sail against it. And the water roars so, and makes so huge noise and so great tempest, that no man may hear another in the ship, though he cried with all the craft that he could in the highest voice that he might. Many great lords have sailed with great will, many times, to pass by those rivers towards paradise, with full great companies. But they might not speed in their voyage. And many died for weariness of rowing against those strong waves. And many of them became blind, and many deaf, for the noise of the water. And some perished and lost within the waves. So that no mortal man may approach to that place, without special grace of God. It is this artesian fountain which is the source of the waters. It acts as a water tower also, feeding all rivers above and below. As described, it is located on the 4th loka up, placing it in the middle of the Sumeru structure. The electrically surcharged condition of the air was a constant vitalizer. I never felt better in my life than during the 2 years my father and I sojourned on the inside of the earth. There is a hazy mist that goes up from the land each evening, and it invariably rains once every 24 hours. This great moisture and invigorating electrical light and warmth account perhaps for the luxuriant vegetation, while the highly charged electrical air, and the evenness of climatic conditions, may have much to do with giant growth and longevity of all animal life. In places, the level valleys stretched away for many miles in every direction. The smoky god, in its clear white light, looked calmly down. There was an intoxication in the electrically surcharged air that fanned the cheek as softly as a vanishing whisper. Nature chanted a lullaby in the faint murmur of winds, whose breath was sweet with the fragrance of bud and blossom. Ladies and gentlemen, this can only be the magnetic land previously described. Based on both its location and its physical effect on every living thing there. At the end of the day, it boils down to resonance. This land is clearly different to that of the Earth, and that simply boils down to where it is within the structure. The South Pole Mount Kumeru does not have the same longevity and giant growth qualities as its northern brother. So magnetically speaking, the North Pole is indeed a special kind of place. In Paradise found page 284. According to all procurable data, that spot at the era of man's appearance upon the stage was in the now lost Miocene continent, which then surrounded the Arctic Pole. That in that true original Eden, some of the early generations of men attained to a stature and longevity, unequaled in any countries known to post-Diluvian history, is by no means scientifically incredible. On the contrary, The exceptional biological conditions of that land, and the remarkable consensus of all traditions respecting the vigor of early giant races, combine to form a fresh illustration of the principle that, the more incredible things an hypothesis explains, the more irresistibly credible the hypothesis itself becomes. So going by the description of this place given by this young boy Olaf Jensen, and applying it to Giannini's physical continuum concept, it wouldn't be a lost or submerged continent. It would just be in a different spot. It would be located exactly where it's described in the writings. In Norse cosmology, Asgard is a city in the sky. Hyperborea is beyond the north wind where the terrestrial and celestial planes meet. Which is also in the sky. It's the same place and the same structure described throughout written history. Speaking of the inhabitants of this land, Olaf states on page 127. We learned that the males do not marry before they are from 75 to 100 years old, and that the age at which women enter wedlock is only a little less, and that both men and women frequently live to be from 6 to 800 years old, and in some instances much older. The people are exceedingly musical, and learn to a remarkable degree in their arts and sciences, especially geometry and astronomy. Their cities are equipped with vast palaces of music, where not infrequently as many as 25,000 lusty voices of this giant race swell forth in mighty choruses of the most sublime symphonies. The children are not supposed to attend institutions of learning before they are 20 years old. Then their school life begins and continues for 30 years, 10 of which are uniformly devoted by both sexes to the study of music. Their principal vocations are architecture, agriculture, horticulture, the raising of vast herds of cattle, and the building of conveyances peculiar to that country, for travel on land and water. By some device which I cannot explain, they hold communion with one another between the most distant parts of their country, on air currents. This device which he cannot describe must be some type of flying vehicle, as it's associated with air currents. Also, Admiral Byrd's encounters with exotic flying machines took place at these locations too. But he states that these beings are learned in geometry and astronomy. How can that be the case in relation to astronomy, if they are inside a sphere? Think about it. The stars that comprise the known universe are on the outside. They can only observe the stars that are directly above the polar openings due to their limited perspective. My thinking is that it would be physically impossible to observe the entire night sky from inside a sphere. But if you place them on Mount Sumeru from Giannini's perspective, they can indeed view the entire cosmos, albeit from a different perspective. So you could definitely put them down as astronomers, as they have as good a view of the stars as anyone else from that location. So that's it for this video. In the next one we'll look at Mr. Giannini's story, and how Admiral Byrd's expeditions apply to his concept. Thank you for watching.